Have you ever wondered what happens when two worlds collide? In clear water, a settler named Robert saves an Apache woman. Sarah and their unexpected bond changes everything. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. If you're excited to discover how love can transcend language and culture, hit that subscribe button and drop a like to join us on this incredible journey. The air hung thick with dust and forgotten dreams in the arid lands north of Tucson. Robert Mitchell wiped the perspiration from his brow, his calloused hands bearing witness to years of wrestling sustenance from the unforgiving earth. Autumn had painted the landscape in muted browns and amber, the colors of endurance rather than splendor. The morning sun cast long shadows across his weathered cabin, a humble structure that had once echoed with Catherine's laughter before fever had claimed her 2 winters past. Papa. James's voice carried across the yard, urgent and thin against the vastness. At 8 years old, his son had already learned the language of responsibility his childhood compressed by necessity. "Emily's been crying again," Robert sighed, setting down his tools. 6-year-old Emily, with her mother's cornflower eyes, still asked when Catherine would return. Some wounds, he had learned, did not heal with the passage of seasons. They merely became familiar companions like the creak in his back or the silence of evenings. "I'll be there shortly," he called back, his voice carrying the weight of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He turned toward the stream that cut through his property, like a silver thread in a faded tapestry. Water had become precious in these parts, more valuable than gold to those who understood life's true currencies. The recent drought had reduced the flow to a whisper, but it persisted, much like hope in desperate times. The sound came to him. First, a soft moan carried on the breeze, so faint he might have imagined it. Following the sound, Robert pushed aside the brittle branches of mesquite, revealing a sight that stole his breath. A woman lay among the rocks, her dark hair spread like spilled ink against the earth. Blood had dried on her temple and along her arm where an arrow had grazed her skin. The intricate patterns woven into her clothing marked her as Apache. Relations between settlers and the indigenous tribes had grown tense as drought pushed both peoples toward the same dwindling resources. Stories of violence circulated in hushed tones in town, fear breeding more fear with each retelling. Yet as Robert knelt beside the unconscious woman, such concerns felt distant. Before him was not a symbol of conflict, but a person in need, her breath shallow against cracked lips. Around her neck hung an amulet of bone and polished stone, catching the light as her chest rose and fell. Robert hesitated only a moment before gathering her into his arms. She weighed little, her frame taut with the resilience required to survive in these lands. "Pa, who is that?" James appeared at his side, eyes wide with uncertainty, as Robert carried the woman toward their cabin. "Someone who needs our help," he replied simply, feeling the woman stir slightly against his chest. Inside, Emily backed away. As Robert laid the stranger on Catherine's old bed, the quilt her mother had stitched, still adorning it with faded wildflowers. "Is she going to hurt us?" his daughter whispered, clutching her rag doll light to her chest. Robert dampened a cloth and began to clean the woman's wounds with gentle hands. "No, little one. She's hurt and far from home." He worked methodically, the silence broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire and the distant call of a mourning dove. As twilight descended, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Robert watched the strange woman's eyelids flutter. For a brief moment he glimpsed dark eyes filled with pain and confusion before they closed again. In that fleeting connection, Robert felt something shift within him, like ground giving way after rain, revealing possibilities previously hidden beneath hardened earth. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying whispers of change. The woman's presence, unexpected and fraught with complication, had already begun to alter the fabric of their isolated existence. As Robert tucked the quilt around her still form, he wondered what stories she carried within her, what forces had brought her to his stream, and what consequence might follow this act of mercy in a land that had forgotten such tenderness. Dawn arrived with the gentle persistence of a memory-pale light, filtering through the cabin's small windows and casting patterns across the earthen floor. Robert had slept fitfully in the chair beside the stranger's bed, waking at each small sound. The woman had remained unconscious through the night, her breathing steadier, but her brow occasionally furrowing, as if pursued even in dreams. Emily approached cautiously in the morning light, her small feet padding across the floorboards. She carried her doll light clutched against her chest, a talisman against the unknown. "Is she going to wake up, Pa?" she whispered, her voice small in the quiet room. Before Robert could answer, the woman's eyes flew open, dark pools reflecting fear and disorientation. She attempted to rise, wincing in pain, as her injuries protested the sudden movement. Words spilled from her lips in a language Robert couldn't understand, but the tone needed no translation. Wariness, confusion, the natural suspicion of one who wakes in unfamiliar surroundings. "It's all right," Robert said, keeping his voice low and even his hands open before him, in a gesture he hoped transcended language. "You're safe here." The woman's gaze darted around the cabin, taking in James standing by the doorway, and Emily half hidden behind her father. Her hand moved to her side, where a weapon might have been finding only the rough fabric of Catherine's old nightdress that Robert had dressed her in after tending her wounds. Seeking connection, Robert knelt slowly by the bedside and picked up a stick from the kindling pile. He drew in the dust of the floor a simple figure of a man, then pointed to himself. "Robert," he said clearly, tapping his chest. The woman watched him with the careful assessment of one accustomed to reading intentions beyond words. After a long moment, she took the stick with slender fingers. Her movements were precise, despite her weakened state, as she drew a figure beside. His adding flowing lines that suggested hair. She touched her own chest. "Sarah," she said, the sound like water over stone. Emily, curiosity overcoming her shyness, stepped forward with a small cup of water. She extended it with both hands, her eyes wide with wonder rather than fear now. "Water," she said carefully, as if teaching a lesson, "for Sarah." The woman, Sarah, looked at the child for a long moment, something softening in her expression. She accepted the cup, her fingers briefly touching Emily's, in a moment that seemed to suspend time. "Water," she repeated the unfamiliar syllables, reshaping themselves on her tongue. Robert watched this exchange with a tightness in his chest that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. It had been so long since anything new had entered their lives, only the cycle of seasons, the repetition of chores, the slow fading of grief into a manageable ache. Sarah sipped the water slowly, her eyes never leaving the door. Robert recognized the calculation in her gaze. She was determining if she was a guest or a prisoner. Deliberately, he moved his rifle from its place by the door to a corner of the room far from reach. Then he opened the cabin door wide, letting in the morning breeze and revealing the path that led away from the homestead. "You're not our prisoner," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but hoping she would grasp their meaning. "When you're stronger, you can go or stay as you choose." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a slight relaxation around her eyes, the barest nod of acknowledgement. She settled back against the pillows, fatigue evident in the way her shoulders curved inward. But when Emily tentatively sat on the edge of the bed, Sarah didn't pull away. Instead, she touched the child's doll with gentle fingers, a question in her eyes. "Light," Emily said proudly, placing the doll in Sarah's hands. "Her name is Light." "Lahit," Sarah repeated, her voice a soft echo as her fingers traced the doll's stitched face with something like wonder. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the juniper tree that marked the edge of Robert's property. A bird landed briefly its song, a bright counterpoint to the silence that had defined their lives for so long. Within the cabin, something equally fragile had begun to take root, a tentative connection, wordless but profound, between three souls adrift and one who had washed up on their shore. As the day stretched toward noon, Robert found himself watching Sarah's hands as she examined Emily's doll, the gentleness there, the care for something precious belonging to another. It was in that moment he realized that whatever complications her presence might bring, something essential had already changed. Like water finding its way through parched earth, the possibility of renewal had entered their home, unexpected but undeniable. Days melted into one another like beeswax in summer heat, marked by the gradual strengthening of Sarah's body, and the tentative growth of understanding between strangers. The cabin, once a vessel of absence, now hummed with the quiet energy of discovery and adaptation. Each morning, Emily would climb onto Sarah's bed with determined enthusiasm, her small hands clutching objects from around the cabin. "Bread," she would announce, holding up a piece of Robert's hearty loaf. "Book," she would declare, patting the worn Bible that had been Catherine's. "Sun," she would say, pointing to the golden light streaming through the window. Sarah absorbed these lessons with a quiet intensity, her eyes following the child's gestures, her lips shaping the unfamiliar sounds with increasing confidence. "Bread," she would repeat the word, becoming more familiar with each utterance. "Book, son." Simple words, yet each one a bridge across the vast divide of their different worlds. James maintained a cautious distance at first, watching from doorways with the wary assessment of a child who had already learned that life could take as easily as it gave. But Sarah noticed him acknowledging his guardedness with respectful space rather than forced overtures. It was only when she showed him how to weave a small grass figure, her fingers moving with practiced precision despite her healing wounds, that his reserve began to thaw like creek ice in spring. "She's smart, Pa," James told Robert one evening as they collected firewood. "She learns faster than I do at school." Robert nodded, watching Sarah through the cabin window as she helped Emily set the table, her movements growing more assured each day. "Different doesn't mean less, son," he said quietly. "Remember that." That night, after the children had succumbed to sleep, Robert pulled out Catherine's old journal, pages still blank, waiting for words that would never come from her hand. He offered it to Sarah, along with a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She accepted both with a questioning glance, her fingers tracing the leather cover with reverence, sensing its importance to him. Robert opened the journal to the first empty page and made a sweeping gesture toward the world outside the cabin. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. She bent over the paper charcoal, moving with purpose. Mountains took shape beneath her hand, a river winding at their base, a small cluster of dwellings, horses grazing on a slope. When she finished, she looked up at Robert, a question in her expression. "Home," he said softly. "Your home." Sarah nodded, touching the drawing lightly. "Home." She repeated the word, heavy with meaning. She pointed to the highest peak she had drawn, then touched her amulet, establishing a connection Robert didn't fully comprehend, but recognized as sacred. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its voice carrying across the silent land. Inside, two people from different worlds sat in companionable silence, the space between them, no longer a void, but a place of patient discovery. Miles away in town, Sheriff's Deputy Thomas Wilson narrowed his eyes as he observed the distant Mitchell homestead through his spyglass. Rumors had reached him of movement on the hill of smoke from the chimney-changing pattern of a figure that wasn't Robert or his children, glimpsed hanging laundry in the yard. Thomas folded his spyglass with a decisive click. Some secrets couldn't remain hidden for long, in a land where survival depended on knowing what lay beyond the next ridge. As if sensing the scrutiny from afar, Sarah looked up from the journal. Toward the window, her expression suddenly alert. Robert followed her gaze, but saw only darkness and the reflection of their own forms in the glass. Yet something had shifted in the atmosphere, like the pressure change before a storm. The sanctuary they had created felt suddenly fragile, a bubble that might burst at the slightest touch from the world beyond. Morning arrived wrapped in mist, the landscape transformed into something otherworldly and indistinct. Robert rose early, his body attuned to the rhythms of farm life despite the changing seasons. The air felt different, charged with an expectancy he couldn't name but recognized in his bones, like the stillness before thunder. Sarah stood at the cabin door, her silhouette outlined against the grey dawn. During the past weeks, she had grown stronger, her movements no longer hampered by pain. She wore a dress of Catherine's that Emily had insisted on giving her, the blue fabric softened by years and altered by Sarah's careful stitching to incorporate elements of her own culture. Patterns along the hem that spoke of mountains and flowing water. "Something's coming," James said quietly, appearing at Robert's side. The boy had developed an uncanny ability to read Sarah's body language, interpreting what her limited English couldn't yet express. Robert nodded, reaching for his rifle more from habit than intention. Sarah turned at the sound, her eyes meeting his with a complexity of emotion that transcended language. She shook her head once definitively and placed her hand on his arm. The gesture was gentle but firm, a request he understood immediately. No weapons, not today. The riders appeared through the mist, like figures from another time. 20 warriors on horseback, their faces painted with ochre and white clay feathers and bone ornaments adorning their hair. They carried bows and spears, but approached slowly, without the tension of imminent attack. Sarah stepped forward, her back straight, and her chin lifted. A mixture of emotions crossed her face: relief, anxiety, determination. From among the warriors, an older man with grey streaks in his long hair rode forward. The resemblance between him and Sarah was unmistakable. The same proud bearing, the same shape of the eyes, though his held decades more of hardship and wisdom. "William," Sarah said clearly, the name seeming strange on her tongue, as if she were translating something more complex into a form Robert could grasp. The older man, William, dismounted with the fluid grace of one who had spent a lifetime on horseback. His gaze moved from Sarah to Robert, then to the children who had gathered behind their father. His assessment was thorough, but not hostile, measuring rather than threatening. Sarah began to speak in her native language, the words flowing like water over stones. Her hands moved as she spoke, gesturing toward her healing wounds, toward Robert, toward the cabin. She touched her amulet, then pointed to the stream where Robert had found her. A younger warrior with sharp eyes and a tense jaw urged his horse forward. "Daniel," Sarah said, introducing him to Robert, with a gesture that suggested complicated history. The young man's expression remained guarded, suspicious, his gaze never leaving Robert as Sarah continued to speak. The challenge of communication hung in the air like the morning mist. Sarah's limited English and Robert's complete unfamiliarity with her language created a gulf that good intentions alone couldn't bridge. The Apache warriors remained mounted, patient, but watchful, their presence transforming the familiar homestead into contested ground. Emily, always the bravest in matters of the heart, stepped forward with a loaf of freshly baked bread in her small hands. She approached William without hesitation, offering the bread with a smile that asked no translation. The older man looked down at the child, something shifting in his stern expression. After a moment of consideration that seemed to contain volumes of thought, he accepted the bread with dignity. He broke off a piece and ate it, then offered pieces to the warriors nearest him. "Thank you," he said in careful accented English, surprising Robert with this bridge across their differences. Sarah smiled, her face illuminated with hope. She turned to Robert, switching to her limited English. "Father," she explained, gesturing to William. "My father." The tension in the air eased slightly, though Daniel and several other warriors maintained their vigilant posture. William spoke again to Sarah, his voice carrying the weight of authority softened by evident affection. Sarah translated haltingly. "We stay on little time. Talk, understand." Robert nodded, setting aside his rifle entirely as a gesture of trust. "You are welcome here," he said simply, knowing the sentiment, if not the specific words, would be understood. The Apache dismounted, establishing a temporary camp at a respectful distance from the cabin. As the day progressed, an uneasy coexistence took shape. James cautiously demonstrated the workings of the water pump to several curious young warriors. Emily, fearless in her childhood innocence, attempted to teach William how to play cat's cradle with a piece of string, her laughter occasionally breaking the solemn atmosphere. At dusk, as the Apache prepared to depart, William approached Robert directly. The two men stood facing each other, representatives of worlds that had rarely found common ground. "My daughter," William said, his English limited but clear. "Why you help?" Robert considered the question, understanding its significance went beyond the immediate circumstances. "Because she needed help," he answered simply. No other reason was necessary. William studied him with ancient eyes that had witnessed the brutal claiming of ancestral lands, the breaking of treaties, the slow strangulation of his people's way of life. Trust did not come easily in such circumstances, yet Robert met his gaze steadily, offering nothing but the truth of his words. As darkness fell, William spoke to Sarah at length, his voice low and measured. She responded with passionate words, gesturing toward the cabin, toward Robert and the children, then toward the distant mountains. When they finished, William turned to Robert once more. "Tomorrow I return," he said, "for decision." The Apache departed like shadows, melting into the night, leaving behind a stillness charged with expectation. Sarah stood watching until the last rider disappeared, her figure silhouetted against the rising moon, caught between worlds, in a way Robert was only beginning to understand. "What decision?" Emily asked, slipping her small hand into Sarah's. Sarah looked down at the child, then at Robert, her eyes containing both fear and hope. "My path," she answered softly. "Where I walk next." That night, as the household settled into uneasy slumber, Robert heard Sarah singing softly to herself, a melody that seemed to carry the vastness of the desert, the endurance of mountains, the persistence of water finding its way through stone. It was a song of belonging and longing intertwined, and though he couldn't understand the words, Robert felt their meaning resonate within his own divided heart. The morning arrived draped in a tapestry of copper and gold, the sun rising above. The eastern hills with majestic indifference to the human dramas unfolding below. Robert had slept little, his mind circling like a hawk around the impending decision that would either sever or strengthen the fragile bonds forming within his household. Sarah stood by the window, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the glass, symbols of her own language telling stories Robert couldn't read but somehow felt in the chambers of his heart. Her face was composed yet vulnerable, revealing the intersection of courage and uncertainty that defined this moment of choosing. "Will you leave us?" Emily asked, her small voice breaking the morning silence. She stood in her nightdress light, clutched against her chest, her eyes wide with the particular clarity of children who ask the questions adults often avoid. Sarah knelt to meet Emily's gaze, cupping the child's face with gentle hands. "Not know yet," she said carefully, her English improving daily, but still constrained. "Heart here, but people there." She gestured first to the cabin, then toward the distant mountains where her tribe awaited William's return. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their exchange, but instead of William's contingent, a single rider appeared. A young woman on a painted pony, her hair braided with blue beads that caught the morning light. She dismounted with graceful efficiency, approaching the cabin with confidence, tempered by caution. "Rachel," Sarah said, surprise and pleasure illuminating her features. She stepped outside to embrace the newcomer, their conversation flowing in their shared language with the ease of long familiarity. Rachel turned to Robert with assessing eyes. Unlike Sarah when she first arrived, this woman carried herself with the assurance of one who moved between worlds. "I am Sarah's cousin," she said in accented but fluent Spanish, which Robert understood from his years working alongside Mexican vaqueros. "I have learned the languages of settlers to help my people negotiate. William sent me ahead to speak for Sarah, who has not yet found her voice in your tongue." The morning unfolded around this new bridge of communication. Through Rachel's translation, Sarah's story emerged in fuller detail, how she had been injured trying to prevent a confrontation between hunters from her clan and settlers encroaching on traditional grounds, how some of her own people blamed her for interfering, viewing her desire for peaceful resolution as weakness or betrayal. "She says you saved her when others would have left her to die." Rachel translated her expression neutral, but her eyes taking the measure of Robert with each word. "She says she has found something here she did not expect." "And what is that?" Robert asked, aware of the weight each word carried across the divide of their different worlds. Rachel conferred with Sarah, their exchange animated, but too quick for Robert to follow even the rhythm of it. When Rachel turned back to him, her expression had softened slightly. "She says she has found respect and possibility." The word hung in the air between them, fragile and potent, as a water droplet capturing sunlight. Possibility. The seed of all transformation, all journeys, all bridges yet unbuilt. By midday, William returned with a smaller group of warriors, including the suspicious Daniel. The presence of Rachel changed the dynamics immediately, allowing for more nuanced communication. Sarah spoke at length, her words flowing through Rachel into Spanish, and then through Robert's understanding into significance. "Sarah wishes to stay," Rachel translated, her voice steady, but her eyes revealing concern. "She believes there is purpose in her being here, that perhaps the stream that nearly claimed her life has instead carried her to a place where two peoples might learn from one another." William's weathered face remained impassive, though his eyes never left his daughter. "And you, settler," he addressed Robert directly in his limited English. "What do you seek from my daughter?" The question carried layers of implication. The Aiki long history of exploitation and betrayal between their peoples, the vulnerability of a woman alone among those who had taken so much from her kind. Robert felt the weight of this history pressing against his own simple truth. "I seek nothing from her," he answered honestly. "She is free to go or stay as she chooses. If she stays, she will have a home here for as long as she wishes, with no obligation beyond what she freely gives." Daniel made a sharp comment in their language, his tone conveying disbelief or derision. Rachel did not translate, but Sarah responded with uncharacteristic fire, her words clearly a rebuke that silenced the young warrior. William considered, in silence, his gaze moving from Sarah to the children, who watched from the porch with solemn attention, to the modest homestead with its carefully tended garden and well-swept yard. Finally he spoke, and Rachel translated, "He says Sarah may stay for now. He will return when the moon is full again to see if her heart remains certain. He says some will not understand this choice, but it is hers to make." Daniel's face darkened, but he kept his peace, bound by the authority of William's decision. The Apache prepared to depart, but before mounting his horse, William approached Sarah. He spoke to her in a low voice, his words meant for her alone, and pressed something into her hand, a small pouch of soft leather, its contents unknown, but clearly precious. As the Apache rode away, Sarah stood in the yard, the leather pouch clutched to her chest, tears tracking silently down her face. Not the tears of grief, but of one standing at a crossroads, feeling both the pain of what is left behind and the hope of what lies ahead. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the yard, Robert found Sarah sitting by the stream where he had first discovered her. The water caught the last light of day, transforming ordinary ripples into molten gold. He approached slowly, allowing her the choice to welcome or refuse his company. Sarah looked up, her expression opening like a night flower. She patted the ground beside her, an invitation that required no translation. Robert sat maintaining a respectful distance, yet close enough to bridge the space between them, if either reached out. "Stay," Sarah said simply, testing the word as if weighing its implications. "I stay." Robert turned to face her fully. "Are you certain your family—" Sarah touched her heart, then gestured toward the cabin where lamplight glowed in the windows, and the children's silhouettes moved in mundane evening ritual. "Family here too now," she said carefully. "New family, different but same." She extended her hand toward him, palm up, not in supplication, but in offering. Robert hesitated only a moment before placing his hand in hers, calloused palm meeting calloused palm, strength recognizing strength. They sat in silence as twilight deepened into night, their joined hands a bridge more eloquent than words, a promise made without fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of water finding its inevitable path through stone. Above them, the first stars appeared ancient and indifferent to human boundaries, yet somehow bearing witness to the moment when two streams converged into a new course, clear and determined. The weeks that followed unfolded like pages, in a story neither had imagined writing. Sarah's presence transformed the homestead in ways both subtle and profound. The cabin, once merely shelter, began to feel like a home again. Herbs hanging from the rafters to dry their aromatic presence, a constant reminder of Sarah's knowledge. Colorful weavings adorning the walls, each pattern telling stories Robert was slowly learning to read. Rachel visited regularly, her role as translator, evolving into that of teacher and cultural bridge. Through her, Sarah's vocabulary expanded beyond immediate needs into expression of ideas and memories. Robert and the children began to learn words, in Sarah's language as well, creating a household where communication flowed through multiple channels. Words imperfect, but increasing gestures, precise silence, comfortable rather than strained. "What is this called?" Emily would ask, holding up objects for Sarah to name in her language. "Tu," Sarah would answer for water, "behe," for deer, "shiu wikan," for the sweet berries that grew by the stream. Emily absorbed these words with the effortless acquisition of childhood, soon chattering in a blend of English and Apache that made Sarah's eyes crinkle with pleasure. One evening, as autumn deepened toward winter, Rachel stayed later than usual. The three adults gathered around the hearth while the children slept. The fire cast dancing shadows across their faces, creating an intimate enclosure where stories could be exchanged like precious gifts. "Sarah wishes to tell you more about how she came to be injured," Rachel translated, her voice low, to avoid waking James and Emily. "She says it is important you understand what happened before, so you may understand what might come." Through Rachel's careful translation, Sarah's full story emerged, how tensions had been building between her clan and settlers, pushing into traditional hunting grounds, how a group of young warriors had planned to attack a homestead in retaliation for cattle that had trampled a sacred site, how Sarah had positioned herself between the warriors and their target, arguing that blood would only lead to more blood. There were those who agreed with her, Rachel explained, and those who saw her actions as betrayal. The argument became heated. In the confusion and anger, she was struck and fell from a high path into the stream that carried her downstream. Robert listened intently, piecing together the currents of conflict that had delivered Sarah to his doorstep. "Who struck her?" he asked. Rachel and Sarah exchanged a glance laden with unspoken complexity. "She does not know for certain," Rachel finally translated. "It happened quickly in darkness and confusion, but she has suspicions." "Daniel," Robert said, recalling the young warrior's hostile demeanor. Sarah nodded slowly, her expression troubled. "Daniel, brother of man who died last summer. Settler kill him, say he steal horse. Daniel, heart full of anger, want blood price." The implications hung in the air between them, weighted with the history of violence and misunderstanding that had defined relations between their peoples. In town, there were still hushed references to the Red Mesa massacre 5 years past, when militia had attacked an Apache camp in retaliation for cattle rustling, leaving women and children among the dead. The wounds of such events remained raw, the scars forming fault lines across the territory. "There are those in town who would not understand Sarah's presence here," Robert acknowledged, thinking of Deputy Wilson's increasing scrutiny of the homestead. Fear runs deep on both sides. Sarah reached for Robert's hand, her gesture deliberate and unhesitating. "Fear, like river," she said directly, without Rachel's translation, "can drown in it, or can build bridge across." Rachel smiled slightly at Sarah's metaphor, adding, "She has always been one who seeks to build rather than destroy. That is why some of our people respect her wisdom, while others mistake her patience for weakness." As the fire burned down to embers casting the room in a soft amber glow, Rachel prepared to leave. At the door, she turned to Robert with a gravity that commanded full attention. "What grows here between you and Sarah, between your children and our ways? It is rare and precious," she said in Spanish, keeping her voice low, "but also dangerous. There are those on both sides who would rather burn a bridge than see others cross it." After Rachel's departure, Sarah and Robert sat in companionable silence, the weight of all that had been revealed settling around them like snowfall, transforming the familiar landscape, requiring careful navigation, but also carrying the potential for beauty in its unfamiliar contours. Sarah took the journal Robert had given her weeks before and opened it to a new page. She had been practicing her letters, forming English words with determined precision. Now she wrote carefully, "Home here now." She showed it to Robert, her eyes seeking confirmation that she had captured her meaning correctly. "Yes," he said softly, something expanding in his chest like warmth spreading from a hearth fire. "This is your home now if you wish it to be." Outside, the night wind carried the scent of coming snow and distant wood smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, eyes watched the cabin's glowing windows, measuring the threat or promise of the unusual alliance forming within. But inside, in the circle of lamplight, two people from different worlds found common ground in the simple recognition of each other's humanity, perhaps the most revolutionary act possible in a land divided by fear and history. The night arrived, without stars, clouds gathering thick and ominous above the homestead, like harbingers of approaching conflict. Robert checked the livestock one final time before retiring, a habit born of years of responsibility. The air felt charged, unsettled, carrying scents of pine and distant rain, but also something acrid that prickled his senses with warning. Sarah stood at the cabin door when he returned, her silhouette outlined against the warm light within. In the weeks since her decision to stay, her presence had become essential to the rhythm of their days. Her quiet competence in household tasks, her patience with the children, her observant silence that often perceived what words might miss. She had draped a shawl around her shoulders, one Rachel had brought from her people, its patterns woven in earth tones that seemed to connect her to the land itself. "Something wrong," she said, her English still accented but increasingly fluid. Her eyes scanned the darkness beyond the yard, alert to disturbances Robert couldn't yet perceive. He had learned to trust her instincts, honed by a lifetime of reading the subtle language of the natural world. "What do you sense?" Sarah frowned, struggling to find the precise words. "Air feels angry, like before storm but not rainstorm." She touched her amulet, a gesture she made when seeking clarity or protection. Should check children again. They had just turned toward the interior when the first flicker of unnatural light caught Robert's peripheral vision. Orange flames licked upward from the corner of the stable, unnaturally bright against the moonless night, spreading with hungry determination across the dry timber. Fire! The word tore from Robert's throat as he sprinted toward the stable where the horses whinnied in rising panic. Sarah was already moving, rushing to the water pump while calling for James to help. Robert reached the stable doors, throwing them open as smoke billowed outward. The horses pushed past him in terrified exodus instinct, driving them away from the consuming flames. Inside, the fire had taken firm hold of the hay bales, creating an inferno that scorched his lungs with each desperate breath. The roof beam cracked, ominously above him, as he struggled to rescue the last frightened calf trapped behind fallen timbers. Time compressed into frantic moments of heat and effort. Robert barely registered Sarah's presence beside him, her strength joining his to free the animal. They had almost reached the door when the burning beam gave way with a thunderous crack. Robert shoved Sarah and the calf forward to safety, but felt searing pain as the timber grazed his shoulder, driving him to his knees. Sarah's hands pulled him forward, her voice urgent but steady in his ear. Together they tumbled into the night, air gasping and smoke-stained as the stable collapsed behind them, in a shower of embers and ash. The next hours passed in a blur of activity, James and Sarah forming a bucket chain from pump to remaining structures, Emily keeping the frightened animals from bolting into the night, Robert fighting through pain to protect what could be saved. By dawn, exhaustion had claimed them all, but the fire had been contained to the stable alone, the cabin and other outbuildings, preserved by their collective effort. As pale morning light revealed the extent of the damage, Robert examined the charred remains with growing certainty. "This was no accident," he said quietly to Sarah, who stood beside him, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes clear and unflinching. "The fire started from outside, not from a lantern or lightning." Sarah nodded, kneeling to examine marks in the earth that most would overlook, a partial footprint, a broken twig. "3 men," she said, with the confidence of one who had learned, tracking from childhood. "Come from South Path, leave same way, fast horses." The implication hung between them, requiring no elaboration. Someone had deliberately targeted the homestead. Whether for Robert's harboring of Sarah for some past grievance, or as a warning, the message was clear: their unusual arrangement had not gone unnoticed or unchallenged. By midday, the physical toll of the night's exertions could no longer be ignored. Robert's shoulder, where the beam had struck him, had swollen and darkened with bruising. Fever began to set in his skin, alternating between burning heat and chilling cold. Sarah guided him to his bed despite his protests, her manner brooking no argument. "Rest now," she said firmly. "I care for this." From her leather pouch, the gift William had given her, she withdrew small packets of herbs and roots. With precise movements, she prepared a poultice of green paste that smelled of earth and bitter medicine. As she applied it to his injured shoulder, her touch was gentle yet confident, her concentration absolute. "What is that?" Robert asked, his voice rough from smoke and fatigue. "Medicine from mountains," Sarah replied, her focus unwavering. "Take pain. Stop. Bad blood. Help heal." Throughout the afternoon, as fever claimed more of Robert's awareness, Sarah remained a constant presence, cooling his brow with damp cloths, offering sips of herbal tea, speaking soft words in her language that sounded like prayers, or perhaps stories. Emily and James moved quietly around the cabin, helping as they could, their young faces solemn with concern, but steady with the resilience children often find in crisis. Night fell once more, bringing a gentle rain that seemed to wash away the last traces of smoke from the air. Robert drifted between consciousness and dreams, his fever finally breaking in the darkest hours before dawn. He awoke to find Sarah still, sitting beside his bed, her posture betraying her exhaustion, even in sleep her hand resting near his, as if to maintain connection even in rest. In the dim light of the banked fire, Robert noticed something placed carefully on his chest, Sarah's bone and stone amulet removed from her own neck and placed over his heart. The gesture's significance moved him deeply, recognizing it as a sharing of protection, a transfer of something sacred from her world to his safekeeping. Emily appeared in the doorway, light clutched in her arms, her small face serious in the pre-dawn shadows. She approached on quiet feet, looking from her father to the sleeping Sarah. "Is she going to be our new mother?" Emily whispered the question, emerging from the direct perception of childhood, unhampered by adult complexities. Robert considered his daughter's words, feeling their weight and possibility. "Would you want her to be?" he asked gently. Emily nodded without hesitation. "She makes the bad dreams go away, and she knows songs the trees understand." She leaned closer, adding with childhood conviction, "And she loves us, I can tell." As if sensing their conversation, Sarah stirred, her eyes opening to find Robert awake and Emily beside him. Something vulnerable and hopeful crossed her face before she composed herself, reaching instinctively for her amulet before remembering she had placed it over Robert's heart. "Keep," she said softly, seeing his hand move toward the amulet. Protection, strong when given freely. Emily climbed onto the bed, inserting herself between them with the natural entitlement of a child. "Sarah," she said seriously, "Daddy wants you, I know." A flush of color rose in Sarah's cheeks, but she did not look away. Instead, she met Robert's gaze with quiet dignity and something deeper, something that had been growing between them through shared work and danger and respect. "I too," she said simply, the brief words containing worlds of meaning. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion on the cabin roof, washing away ash and soot, preparing the earth for new growth. Inside, in the quiet sanctuary they had defended together, three people sat in a moment of perfect understanding, a family forming not from obligation or convention, but from choice and recognition, and the quiet courage to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. The aftermath of fire brought unexpected growth, like wildflowers blooming in landscape cleared by flame. News of the incident spread through both communities, the settlers in town and the Apache camped in the hills, creating ripples of concern, speculation, and in some quarters, resentment. Yet it also crystallized the bonds within the homestead, forging what had been tentative connection into something more resilient. Robert's shoulder healed with remarkable speed under Sarah's care, her knowledge of medicinal plants proving more effective than the town doctor's conventional treatments. The stable was rebuilt with the help of two neighboring homesteaders who, while curious about Sarah's presence, respected Robert enough to offer assistance without judgment. Sarah worked alongside the men, her strength and practical knowledge earning reluctant admiration. Autumn deepened the landscape, transformed by frost, and the rich amber light particular to the season. Sarah had begun teaching Emily and James the Apache names for plants and animals, showing them which roots could be eaten, which berries would dye cloth, which bark could ease a cough. In return, Robert showed Sarah how to read from Catherine's old Bible, her finger tracing the mysterious symbols that gradually revealed their meaning under his patient guidance. Words stay on paper, Sarah marveled one evening after successfully reading a full sentence aloud. Like tracks but never wash away in rain. Yes, Robert replied, something warming in his chest at her insight. That's exactly right. The sound of an approaching wagon interrupted their lesson. Robert tensed instinctively. Visitors were rare, and rarer still since Sarah's arrival had become known in town. Through the window, he recognized Reverend Johnson's distinctive black hat and the rigid posture that spoke of rigid thinking. "Stay inside with the children," Robert told Sarah, noting how she immediately moved to gather Emily and James, her protective instincts matching his own. The Reverend was not alone. Beside him sat Mrs. Cooper, the widow, whose influential position in town was matched only by her dedication to civilizing what she termed the savage elements of the territory. Her thin lips and narrowed eyes suggested she had not come for a social call. "Mitchell," Reverend Johnson acknowledged stiffly as Robert stepped onto the porch. "We've come on a matter of Christian duty and moral necessity." Robert maintained a neutral expression, though wariness settled like a physical weight between his shoulder blades. "Reverend, Mrs. Cooper, what brings you out this far?" Mrs. Cooper adjusted her shawl with precise movements. "Word has reached us that you're harboring an Indian woman, that you're allowing her to influence your children." Her gaze swept past Robert to the cabin windows, searching for confirmation. "Sarah is a guest in my home," Robert replied evenly. "And yes, she helps with the children." The Reverend cleared his throat, his expression a mixture of disapproval and what he likely believed was Christian concern. "We've come to offer a solution, Mitchell. The Sisters of Mercy have an orphanage in Santa Barbara, where indigenous women are taught proper Christian ways, domestic skills befitting their station. They could take her, civilize her." "Redemption," Mrs. Cooper added with the certainty of those who have never questioned their own righteousness. "It's what these people need. Surely you can see the impropriety of the current arrangement." Robert felt heat rise in his face and anger he carefully contained. "There is no impropriety in offering shelter and receiving wisdom in return. Sarah is not in need of redemption, Reverend. She is a healer, a teacher, and she stays here by her own choice." "Choice?" Mrs. Cooper's voice rose slightly. "These people don't understand the concept of choice as we do. They need guidance structure. I choose." The voice came from behind Robert, clear and firm. Sarah stood in the doorway, her posture straight and dignified, despite the scrutiny of the visitors. She had been learning English with remarkable speed, her determination to communicate in Robert's language, matched by his family's efforts to learn hers. "I live here," Sarah continued, each word carefully pronounced. "Not prisoner, not lost. I choose this place, these people." The Reverend's eyes widened at her direct address, as if surprised to find her capable of speech. "My dear woman, you don't understand what's best for your kind. The sisters could teach you to be a proper Christian woman, to serve God in appropriate—" "Her ways serve God many ways," Sarah interrupted, touching her amulet. "In mountains, in streams, in how we treat others. Great Spirit, same, just different names." Robert moved slightly closer to Sarah, not touching her, but positioning himself as ally rather than protector. The gesture was not lost on their visitors, whose expressions shifted from condescension to something harder. "Mitchell," Reverend Johnson's tone hardened, "I urge you to reconsider. There are those in town who view this arrangement with deep concern. The influence on your children alone. My children are learning compassion, respect for difference, and valuable skills," Robert interrupted. "They are thriving under Sarah's care." As if summoned by mention of them, Emily appeared at Sarah's side, her small hand slipping naturally into the Apache woman's. The child looked at the visitors with clear, direct eyes that held none of the fear or confusion the adults might have expected. "Sarah teaches us the best stories," she announced, "about how the stars are all connected and how to listen to trees." Reverend Johnson opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a new arrival. William emerged from the tree line at the edge of the property, accompanied by Rachel and 3 other Apache. They approached slowly, without threat, but with undeniable purpose. Mrs. Cooper gasped softly, her hand fluttering to her throat in alarm. "Mitchell, do you know these people are here?" "Sarah's family is always welcome," Robert replied calmly, though he had not expected William's visit. "As are you, Reverend, when you come in friendship rather than judgment." William approached with the measured dignity that seemed his constant state, his gaze taking in the scene with ancient wisdom. Rachel stood beside him, acting as translator, but also observer, her intelligent eyes, missing nothing of the dynamics at play. "My father comes to speak of important matters," Sarah said in Spanish, which Rachel translated for William. "Perhaps Reverend Johnson and Mrs. Cooper would like to witness how people of different traditions can find common ground." The suggestion, so reasonable and yet so contrary to their worldview, left the visitors momentarily speechless. Taking advantage of their hesitation, Robert invited everyone inside, creating a tableau that would have been unimaginable months before. Apache elders and town dignitaries gathered around the same hearth, united only by their connection to the remarkable woman who moved between both worlds with increasing confidence. William spoke first, his words flowing through Rachel's translation. "We have been watching what grows here," he said, gesturing to encompass the homestead. "A place between worlds where old enemies might become new allies. I have come to propose something that may seem strange to both peoples." The conversation that followed was unlike any Robert had experienced, measured, complex, challenging perspectives on both sides. William proposed creating a neutral ground, a place where Apache and settlers might meet for trade and counsel without fear, where children might learn each other's ways, where the wisdom of both traditions might be preserved rather than erased. "Clear water," Sarah said suddenly in English. "This place, where stream runs clean between mountains and town, not one side or other side. New place." The name settled into the room like a seed finding fertile soil. Clear water. Not just the physical description of the stream that had carried Sarah to this new life, but the metaphor for clarity of vision, for transparency of purpose, for the washing away of old prejudices. Reverend Johnson listened with evident discomfort, but growing curiosity. Mrs. Cooper maintained her rigid posture, though something in her expression suggested concepts shifting beneath the surface of her certainty. When William finished speaking, a silence hung in the room, not the silence of completion, but of beginning of possibilities taking shape. "This is most irregular," the Reverend finally said. "The town council would have serious reservations, and the military authorities have no jurisdiction over private property freely shared," Robert completed. "This land is mine by territorial grant. What happens here is my decision and Sarah's and anyone who chooses to participate." The Reverend stood, signaling Mrs. Cooper to do the same. "We will be discussing this with the council," he said, his tone making clear this was not an endorsement but a retreat to gather forces. "Mitchell, I urge you to consider the consequences of the path you're choosing." After they departed, tension remained in the cabin like the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume. William studied Robert with eyes that had witnessed decades of broken promises and betrayal. "Settler words often change with the wind," he said through Rachel. "How can we trust what is built here will last?" Before Robert could answer, Emily stepped forward, her small face solemn with childhood gravity. She wrapped her arms around Sarah's waist, looking up at William without fear. "Sarah is our mum too now," she declared with the absolute certainty of a child's heart. "And you're our family too. That's how." William's weathered face softened, almost imperceptibly. He knelt to Emily's level, his movement deliberate and dignified. "Then we have something stronger than words to build upon," he said, his hand gently touching the child's hair in blessing. Outside, the autumn wind stirred, fallen leaves into dancing spirals, red and gold, catching the afternoon light like promises of transformation. Within the cabin, something equally significant had taken root. A vision of what might be possible when courage overcame fear, when bridges replaced boundaries, when clear water flowed between divided lands, carrying possibility rather than separation. Spring arrived in a symphony of renewal. Wildflowers punctuating the landscape, with bold color birds returning with songs more complex than human language could capture, creeks swollen with snowmelt from distant peaks. The transformation of the land mirrored the evolution taking place at what was now known throughout the region as Clear Water. What had begun as Robert's isolated homestead had expanded into something unique in the territory, a place where boundaries blurred and new possibilities took root. A small settlement had formed on the property, with several Apache families erecting traditional dwellings alongside cabins built by settlers willing to take a chance on a different kind of community. Where distrust had once prevailed, cautious, cooperation now grew nurtured by daily interaction and shared purpose. Sarah moved through this emerging world with quiet confidence, her role evolving beyond Robert's household to become something more profound. A bridge between cultures, a keeper of balance, a living example of how adaptation need not mean erasure. Her English had improved dramatically, though she retained an accent that gave her words a rhythmic quality, like poetry spoken rather than merely uttered. "The school needs roof before summer rains," she told Robert one morning as they walked, the perimeter of the new building taking shape at the center of the settlement. Simple in design but significant in purpose, the structure would serve as both schoolhouse and meeting place, where children and adults from both communities could exchange knowledge rather than suspicion. Robert nodded, appreciating how Sarah's mind constantly moved between immediate needs and longer vision. "William says some of the younger men will help raise the beams next week, and Johnson has convinced 2 families from town to send their children once it's completed." The mention of Reverend Johnson brought a small smile to Sarah's face. The man's transformation over recent months had been unexpected but genuine, his initial resistance giving way to cautious curiosity and finally to active support, though always framed in terms of Christian duty rather than admission of error. "The Reverend's heart is good," Sarah observed, "even when his words are stiff like new leather." Robert laughed at her apt description. "You see people clearly, Sarah. It's one of your many gifts." She turned to him, then her dark eyes reflecting the morning light. In her expression, Robert saw the same openness and strength that had first captured his attention when she lay injured beside the stream, but now tempered with confidence and purpose that came from finding her place in this new world they were creating together. "Many gifts shared here," she replied, gesturing toward the settlement where Apache women were teaching white settlers about medicinal plants while receiving instruction in reading and writing in return. Children played together, switching between languages with the effortless adaptation of the young, creating their own hybrid communication that contained elements of both worlds. As twilight approached that evening, Robert found Sarah at the stream that had become sacred ground for their unusual family. She sat with her feet in the water, her face lifted to catch the last golden light of day. The sight stirred something, profound in his chest, not the desperate longing of earlier days, but a deeper recognition, a certainty that had grown steadily like a tree finding purchase in once barren ground. He approached quietly, respecting her moment of solitude but drawn to her presence like a traveler to hearthfire. Sarah smiled as he sat beside her, unsurprised by his arrival, as if she had been waiting for him without conscious expectation. For a time they simply existed together in the gentle sound of flowing water and evening bird song. Words seemed superfluous in the face of all they had built together, a home, a community, a new way of living that honored the best of both their traditions while creating something neither had imagined possible. "Emily asked today," Sarah finally said, her voice soft against the backdrop of rustling leaves, "if you my husband now." Robert felt warmth rise in his face, though not from embarrassment. "What did you tell her?" Sarah looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. "I say not yet with words, but yes with heart." The simple truth of her statement pierced him with its clarity. They had moved slowly, respectfully, building understanding before affection, partnership before intimacy. But the reality of what had grown between them could no longer be denied or contained in the polite fiction of household arrangement they had maintained for the sake of both their communities. "Sarah," Robert said, taking her hand in his feeling, the strength in her fingers, the calluses that spoke of work and purpose. "Would you want that to be husband and wife, not just in heart but in word?" She considered his question with the thoughtfulness she brought to all significant matters, neither rushing toward nor away from its implications. "Different peoples, different customs," she finally said, My people speak of joining through seasons of moon through shared fire and water. Your people speak of papers and promises before God. How make one way from two? Perhaps we don't have to choose, Robert suggested. Perhaps like everything at Clearwater, we can create something that honors both traditions while becoming something new. Sarah's smile bloomed slowly like the desert flowers that appeared after rain, rare and therefore precious. Then yes, she said simply. I would be wife to you in all ways our peoples understand, and in new ways we make together. She leaned forward, then her free hand coming to rest against his chest where his heart beat with steady purpose. I love you, she said in careful English, each word given the weight of conscious choice. Not because you saved me by stream, but because you see me as I am. Not because you father to Emily and James, but because you teach them to see with clear eyes. Not because you build this place of peace, but because you first built peace in your own heart. Robert covered her hand with his own, feeling the miraculous ordinariness of their connection, how something that might seem extraordinary to the outside world had become the natural center of his existence, as essential as the rhythm of seasons or the cycle of day and night. I love you, he echoed, the simple words containing universes of meaning, for teaching me that what seemed like ending was only a different kind of beginning. As darkness settled around them, stars appearing in the vast canopy above, they remained by the stream that had brought them together. In the water's constant movement, they recognized the truth of their own journey, ever-flowing, finding new paths when obstacles appeared, gathering strength from joining with others, and always moving toward some larger belonging that neither could fully comprehend, but both could feel in the quiet certainty of their joined hands. In the settlement behind them, lamps were being lit in windows, creating constellations on earth to mirror those emerging in the sky. Points of warmth and humanity in what had once been darkness, each small light a testament to the possibility of transformation when courage overcame fear, when compassion refused to yield to history's heavy weight. The summer sun beat down upon Clearwater with relentless intensity, turning the stream to a mere trickle and the surrounding land to dusty gold. Yet despite the physical drought, the settlement continued to flourish, a testament to the determination of its inhabitants and the strength of the vision that bound them together. The school building stood completed now, its simple structure housing complex possibilities. Inside, children from both communities learned together their education, a blend of traditional Apache wisdom and settler knowledge. Emily, now 7, proudly carried her slate to Sarah each evening, showing off newly formed letters and numbers with the particular joy of a child discovering her own capabilities. Look, Sarah, mother, she would exclaim, using the name she had created to honor both her birth mother's memory and the woman who now filled that role with gentle strength. Teacher says my writing is the neatest in class. Sarah would examine the slate with appropriate solemnity before breaking into a smile that transformed her whole face. Beautiful marks, she would affirm, strong like the one who makes them. James, approaching 10 with the gangling awkwardness of early adolescence, maintained a boy's pretense of indifference to learning while absorbing everything around him with keen intelligence. Under William's patient tutelage, he had become skilled in tracking and hunting, able to move through the landscape with a silence and awareness that merged his settler upbringing with Apache traditions. The morning began like many others that summer. Chores attended to in the cooler hours, preparations made for the community council meeting scheduled for midday. Sarah had risen before dawn to gather herbs that were most potent in early light. Returning to find Robert and the children at breakfast, the domesticity of the scene a constant source of quiet joy. Daniel has returned, she mentioned casually as she hung bundles of sage and mint from the cabin rafters. I saw him speaking with some of the younger men at the edge of the settlement. Robert looked up sharply, noting the careful neutrality in Sarah's tone. Daniel's opposition to Clearwater had remained steadfast, his disapproval of Sarah's choices openly expressed whenever he visited his kin who had joined the settlement. His presence never boded well for community harmony. Did he say why he's come? Robert asked, keeping his voice level for the children's benefit. Sarah shook her head, her movements deliberate as she arranged her harvested plants. He speaks less to me with each visit, but his eyes say what his mouth does not. The implications hung in the air between them, acknowledged, but not dwelled upon. In the months since Clearwater's founding, they had faced opposition from both sides, suspicious settlers from town traditionalist Apache, who viewed the experiment as capitulation rather than cooperation. Yet for every voice raised in criticism, others had joined in support, drawn by the promise of a different way forward. Emily broke the moment of tension with a child's perfect timing. "Can I wear the blue ribbon today? Rachel braided my hair special." "Yesterday." Sarah smiled, the concern in her eyes giving way to present joy. "Yes, Shiaji, little one. Blue ribbon for council meeting. Show everyone how settler girl learns Apache ways." The morning progressed with usual routines until Sarah realized Emily was no longer playing in the yard, where she had been fashioning a doll from corn husks. Initially unconcerned, the child often visited her friends in the settlement. Sarah felt a growing unease as noon approached with no sign of her return. "Have you seen Emily?" she asked James, who was helping Robert repair a wagon wheel. The boy shook his head, suddenly alert to the worry in Sarah's voice. "Not since breakfast." "Want me to look for her?" A thorough search of the settlement yielded nothing but increasing concern. Emily's friends had not seen her. She had not gone to the schoolhouse or to Rachel's dwelling. As word spread, members of both communities joined, the search fanning out across the property with growing urgency. It was William who found the tracks, small footprints matching Emily's alongside larger ones that he identified without hesitation. "Daniel," he said grimly, pointing to distinctive marks left by a slight favoring of the right foot. The child did not go unwillingly at first. There is no sign of struggle, but they went toward the high country, away from all paths. The knowledge fell like a stone into still water ripples of implications spreading outward. Daniel had taken Emily, not by force initially, perhaps luring her with some story or promise, but away from safety into terrain where tracking would be difficult. "Why?" Robert's voice cracked with the strain of controlled fear. What could he possibly want with her? Sarah's face had gone still, the expression familiar to those who knew her well. Not absence of feeling, but its careful containment emotion, channeled into clarity of thought and purpose. "To break what we have built," she said quietly. "To force conflict that destroys trust between our peoples." She turned to William, speaking rapidly in their shared language. The older man nodded, issuing instructions to the gathered Apache. Within moments, a search party had formed. Experienced trackers who knew the high country and could move through it with greater speed than settlers. "I'm coming too," Robert insisted, checking his rifle with hands that remained steady, despite the terror clutching at his heart. Sarah placed her hand on his arm, her touch both restraint and connection. "No," she said firmly. "Daniel wants you to follow in anger, to create blood between Apache and settler. I will go with Rachel, woman to woman, Apache to Apache. Safer for Emily this way." The logic was undeniable, but the prospect of remaining behind while his child was in danger cut against every instinct Robert possessed. "Sarah, I can't just wait here. Trust me," she interrupted, her eyes holding his with unwavering certainty. "As I trusted you by stream, now water flows other direction, but same trust. I bring her home." In that moment, looking into Sarah's resolute face, Robert recognized the truth that had been growing between them through all the seasons of their unusual bond. Trust was not a single act, but a continuous choice, renewed in each challenge, strengthened by each fulfillment. He nodded once the movement containing volumes of unspoken understanding. Sarah prepared swiftly, taking only what was essential: water, dried meat, her medicine pouch, and the knife Robert had given her months before. Rachel joined her, similarly equipped, her face set with determination. As they prepared to depart with the tracking party, Sarah returned briefly to Robert's side. "Emily is daughter of my heart now," she said, her voice low and intense. "I bring her back safe or not return myself." Before he could respond, she was gone, moving with the fluid grace that marked her people's relationship with the land. Not conquering it, but becoming part of its rhythm, reading its language, flowing through its contours, like water finding its natural path. The hours of waiting stretched into an eternity of imagined scenarios, each more devastating than the last. Robert moved mechanically through necessary tasks, kept company by James's solemn presence, and the quiet support of the community that gathered at Clearwater's central meeting place, settlers and Apache alike maintaining vigil. Twilight was descending when the first call came from the lookout, posted at the settlement's edge. Figures were approaching, several moving as one descending from the foothills with measured pace. As they drew closer, Robert could make out Sarah's familiar form and beside her small but walking on her own strength Emily. Relief crashed through him like a physical force, nearly driving him to his knees. He ran to meet them, gathering Emily into his arms, feeling the solid reality of her small body against his chest, her arms wrapping around his neck with familiar trust. "I'm sorry, Pa," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Daniel said he would show me the sacred mountain where the eagle spirits live. I didn't know we were going so far." "You're safe now," Robert assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "That's all that matters." Over Emily's head, his eyes met Sarah's, reading in her expression that there was more to tell, but not in this moment of reunion, not in the child's hearing. The search party returned in full, but Daniel was not among them. Sarah's clothing was dusty from travel, but unmarked by violence. Whatever confrontation had occurred had not resulted in bloodshed. Later, after Emily had been fed and put to bed, her small body exhausted by the day's ordeal, Sarah and Robert sat by the dying embers of the hearth fire. The cabin was quiet, the rhythm of the children's breathing a counterpoint to the occasional pop and hiss of settling coals. "What happened?" Robert asked simply. Sarah was silent for a long moment, her face illuminated by the fire's glow shadows accentuating the strong lines of her features. "I found them near the high ridge," she finally said. Daniel had told Emily stories to keep her walking, but she was tired, beginning to be afraid. "When he saw me, he pulled her close, said she would be raised as true Apache, not in this false place we have made." She sighed, rubbing the amulet that hung at her neck. "I told him I knew what lived in his heart, the pain of his brother's death, the fear that our people's coming together would erase what makes us Apache. I told him I understood his fear, but that fear cannot guide us if we wish to survive. And he just let her go." Robert found this difficult to believe, knowing Daniel's hostility. Sarah smiled slightly, though the expression held sadness rather than triumph. "No. I told him he could take me instead, that I would go with him voluntarily back to the traditional camps, renounce my place here, if he would return Emily unharmed." Robert felt his heart constrict at the magnitude of her offering, to sacrifice the life they had built, the community they had created, the love that had grown between them all for his daughter's safety. "Sarah," she raised her hand, the gesture gently stopping his words. "Let me finish." Daniel looked at me for a long time, then at Emily. He saw something in her face, perhaps the same innocence he remembers from his own childhood, before violence changed everything. He said, "You would give up your new life for this settler child." Sarah's voice softened, remembering. I told him, "She is not settler child to me. She is simply my child, as James is my child, as all children at Clearwater are our children, Apache and settler together." And something in him broke open, not like weakness, but like seed finally cracking to let new growth emerge. "He let her go," Robert finished, understanding dawning. Sarah nodded. "He let her go. He will not return to Clearwater, I think. But neither will he work against us now. Sometimes to find peace, we must first acknowledge the legitimacy of each other's pain." Robert reached for her hand, marveling yet again at the wisdom of this woman who had entered his life, like an unexpected current, altering its course permanently. "You could have lost everything," he said quietly. Sarah's fingers tightened around, her eyes reflecting firelight and deeper certainties. "No," she corrected gently. "I would have lost much that I treasure, but not everything. Not the knowledge that love is strongest when it is willing to open its hands and release what it holds most dear." Outside, a night bird called into the darkness, its voice carrying across the settlement, where two peoples had begun the delicate work of creating something new from ancient traditions. Inside, in the circle of warmth they had defended and expanded, Robert and Sarah sat in companionable silence, their joined hands, a bridge more eloquent than words, their shared vision of Clearwater flowing forward into possibility, like its namesake, stream, sometimes reduced to a trickle in drought, sometimes tested by storm but always finding its way forward. The aspens had turned to gold and crimson when the territorial governor's carriage arrived at Clearwater, its polished surfaces incongruous against the settlement's practical simplicity. The visit had been arranged through Reverend Johnson's connections, a culmination of months of careful diplomacy and growing regional interest in the unusual community taking shape on Robert Mitchell's former homestead. Governor Harrison stepped down from the carriage with the practiced dignity of a career politician. His salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed his clothing, fine, but not ostentatious. His eyes, however, revealed genuine curiosity as he surveyed the blend of traditional Apache dwellings and settler cabins arranged in a rough circle around the central meeting house and school. "Mr. Mitchell," he greeted Robert with a firm handshake. "I've heard much about your experiment here. Some call it foolhardy, others visionary." His gaze shifted to Sarah, who stood at Robert's side in a dress that combined settler design with Apache beadwork and patterns. "And this must be the remarkable woman I've heard so much about." Sarah met his assessing look with quiet dignity. "Welcome to Clearwater, Governor," she said, her English clear and confident despite her accent. "We are honored by your interest in our community." Something in the governor's expression shifted subtly, perhaps surprise at her articulate response, perhaps recognition that the reality before him was more complex than the reports he had received. "The honor is mine, Mrs. Mitchell." The correction came gently but firmly from Sarah. "Sarah Two Rivers," she said. "My Apache name and my new place, together as one. Here at Clearwater we keep what is true from our separate pasts while building shared future." Governor Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Sarah Two Rivers, then. I look forward to understanding what you've created here." The tour that followed revealed Clearwater's unique character. The school where children learned multiplication tables alongside traditional stories and plant identification. The meeting house where disputes were resolved through a council of both Apache and settler representatives. The communal gardens where ancient irrigation techniques merged with newer farming methods. "The children speak 3 languages now," Robert explained, as they passed a schoolhouse where Emily could be seen practicing her letters. "English, Spanish, and Apache. They move between worlds with an ease I envy sometimes." The governor observed it all with careful attention, his questions probing but not hostile. By evening, when the community gathered for a shared meal in his honor, his initial reserve had given way to genuine engagement. He sat between Robert and William at the head table, with Sarah and Rachel nearby to facilitate translation when needed. "Tell me," he asked during a lull in the general conversation, "how do you handle the problems that must inevitably arise, disputes over water rights, cultural differences, religious practices?" William, his dignity undiminished by age, answered through Rachel's translation. "We begin by assuming good intention, not threat. When water is scarce, we remember that thirst feels the same in every language. When customs differ, we explain rather than demand. When misunderstanding comes, and it does come, we bring it to council fire, speak truth, plainly find path forward that honors both ways." "It sounds idealistic," the governor commented, though his tone held curiosity rather than dismissal. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her presence commanding attention without requiring volume. "Not ideal," she corrected. "Real, hard work, daily choice, sometimes fail, begin again. But children watch us choose peace instead of old anger. They learn this path by walking it with us." As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the central clearing, and the community's monthly celebration began, music from both traditions merging into something new and vital, dancing that respected differences, while finding common rhythms, stories told in multiple languages, yet understood through shared humanity. Governor Harrison watched it all with increasing interest, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. Near midnight, as the celebration continued around them, he drew Robert and Sarah aside. "I came here with skepticism," he admitted, his voice low and confidential. "The reports I received described everything from a dangerous insurrection to a naive experiment doomed to failure. What I've found is something else entirely." Robert and Sarah exchanged a glance, the communication between them requiring no words after so many seasons of shared purpose. "What you've done here deserves protection." The governor continued his decision, apparently reached. "The territory needs examples of cooperation, not conflict. I'll be sending a formal letter designating Clearwater as a protected settlement under territorial authority." The implications were significant. Official recognition, a degree of autonomy protection from those who might see Clearwater as a threat to established order or traditional boundaries. It was more than they had dared hope for when the governor's visit was first announced. "We are grateful," Robert said, simply knowing that elaborate expressions of gratitude would diminish the dignity of the moment. The governor looked between them, his political experience giving way to more personal observation. "You two have built something remarkable here. Not just a settlement, but a new kind of family, a new vision of what might be possible in this territory." He hesitated, then added with unexpected candor, "My wife would have appreciated what you've created. She always believed in the possibility of finding common ground." The past tense was not lost on either of them. Sarah responded with the directness that characterized her nature. "She still sees from place beyond seeing. Ancestors watch our choices, guide our hands when we listen well." Rather than taking offense at this blending of spiritual traditions, the governor nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right, Mrs. Sarah Two Rivers. Perhaps you're right." 2 days later, as the governor's carriage disappeared down the road toward town, Robert found Sarah by the stream that had given their community its name. She sat with her feet in the water, face turned toward the afternoon sun, her expression peaceful yet thoughtful. "You're quiet today," he observed, settling beside her on the grassy bank. Sarah smiled, the expression warming her serious features. "Many words these past days. Now time for silence to let meaning settle like silt in still pool." Robert nodded, understanding her need for reflection. They had come so far from that first day when he had found her injured beside this very stream, from wariness to trust, from awkward communication to deep understanding, from two separate paths to one shared journey. Yet there remained one transition they had discussed, but not completed. "William spoke to me this morning," he said after a comfortable silence, "about Apache marriage traditions." Sarah turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting both the water's surface and her own deep consideration. "And Reverend Johnson speaks to you last week about Christian ceremony," she noted, missing nothing that occurred in their community. "Yes," Robert acknowledged, "though his ideas have expanded considerably since he first visited us." A smile touched the corner of Sarah's mouth. "The Reverend's mind, like leather, stiff at first, but softens with use and care." Robert laughed at the apt description, marveling yet again at Sarah's ability to perceive essential truths beneath surface appearances. "He suggested something I thought might appeal to you," he continued. "A ceremony that honors both traditions, Apache and Christian, creating something new that belongs fully to neither, and yet respects both." Sarah's expression softened her, hand finding his on the grass between them. "Like Clearwater itself," she said quietly, "like us." The wedding of Robert Mitchell and Sarah Two Rivers took place as autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold, the beauty of transition a fitting backdrop for their union. The ceremony combined elements that would have been unimaginable years before. Reverend Johnson and William standing side by side as officiant scripture readings, followed by traditional Apache blessings, settler hymns interwoven with drums and flutes. Sarah wore a dress of pale buckskin, adorned with beadwork in patterns that told the story of her journey. Mountains and streams, hardship and healing, separate paths converging into one. Around her neck hung the amulet that had accompanied her, through every transition now supplemented by a silver band on her finger that reflected Robert's tradition. Emily and James participated in both aspects of the ceremony, carrying offerings of corn and spring water, speaking words in multiple languages, their young faces solemn with the recognition that this formalization merely acknowledged what had already become true in daily life and shared purpose. When it came time for Sarah to speak, she stood before the gathered community, Apache and settler together, with the quiet confidence that had become her hallmark at Clearwater. "Here live together," she said in English, still accented but clear and strong. Different but same heart, like stream joining river, stronger together than apart. She turned to face Robert directly, her eyes holding his with unwavering certainty. I choose this man not because need shelter or protection. Choose because he sees with clear eyes, listens with open heart, builds with strong hands. Choose because together we make new path where children walk free from old fears. Robert's response came from depths he had not known existed before Sarah entered his life. I choose this woman not because she fills an absence, but because she creates presence. Not because she completes what was broken, but because she reveals what is possible. Together we will continue building Clearwater, not just as a place on earth, but as a way of living that honors difference while celebrating connection. Their hands joined before the assembled witnesses, Apache and settler, clasping wrists in a gesture, as ancient as human community, yet as fresh as their shared vision. Above them an eagle circled in the autumn sky, a sign William interpreted as ancestral blessing. Reverend Johnson saw as divine approval, and the children of Clearwater accepted simply as part of the rightness of the day. The school was officially opened that same afternoon, its completion coinciding deliberately with the wedding celebration. Sarah's bone amulet, the one she had worn since childhood and placed on Robert's chest during his fever, had been framed and mounted on the central wall, a reminder of the act of compassion that had begun everything. Emily, now proudly able to write in flowing script, carefully painted the settlement's name above the schoolhouse door, Clearwater. The letters stood bold against the weathered wood, a declaration of identity and purpose that needed no translation. As sunset painted the sky in impossible hues of lavender and amber, Sarah and Robert stood together on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the community they had helped create continue its celebration. Children played games that borrowed elements from both cultures. Elders shared stories that preserved wisdom, while adding new chapters. Musicians found harmonies that belonged neither to one tradition nor the other, but to something still being born. Beginnings always hard, Sarah said softly, leaning against Robert's shoulder as twilight deepened around them. But this one beautiful yes. Robert's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer with the easy familiarity of those who have chosen each other deliberately, repeatedly, through difficulty and joy. Beautiful. He agreed, the word containing all he could not express about the woman beside him, the community before him, and the future they continued to build with each choice, each day, each act of courage and compassion. In the gathering darkness, lanterns were lit throughout the settlement, creating constellations on earth to mirror those appearing in the sky above. Points of light, marking human presence in the vastness, testaments to the possibility that even in a land scarred by division, Clearwater could still flow, carrying hope forward into territories yet unmapped. 2 years passed, the seasons turning with the reliable rhythm that governed life at Clearwater. Winter brought snow that transformed the landscape into crystalline beauty and gathered the community close around hearth fires where stories were shared and plans made. Spring erupted in wildflower abundance, summer ripened the gardens and strengthened the bonds between families, and autumn again painted the world in amber and crimson before the cycle began anew. The settlement had prospered beyond what even its founders had imagined possible. What had begun as a tentative experiment in coexistence had evolved into a thriving community with sturdy homes replacing temporary shelters a watermill constructed, where the stream provided consistent power, and the school expanded to accommodate children from neighboring homesteads who traveled daily for the unique education offered there. Sarah and Robert's cabin had grown as well, additional rooms built to accommodate not only Emily and James, now 9 and 12, growing tall and confident in this place of blended traditions, but also the newest member of their family. Michael Two Rivers Mitchell had arrived in the depths of winter, his birth attended by both the local midwife and Rachel's mother, a respected Apache healer. With his father's strong build and his mother's dark, observant eyes, the infant embodied, in his very existence, the vision Clearwater represented. Sarah moved through her days with the quiet efficiency that had become her hallmark. Her authority in the community, established not through assertion, but through consistent wisdom and uncompromising compassion. She taught at the school 3 mornings each week, her lessons focusing on medicinal plants and the Apache understanding of the natural world. Settler women who had once viewed her with suspicion now sought her advice on child-rearing and healing, while maintaining respectful exchange rather than appropriation of her knowledge. Robert had found a new dimension to his capabilities as well. His natural skills as a builder expanded into helping design systems that served the growing settlement, irrigation methods that conserved precious water, construction techniques that incorporated the best of both cultures' traditions. Together with William and a council of both Apache and settler representatives, he helped navigate the complex balance of preserving cultural integrity while fostering meaningful integration. Even Reverend Johnson had found his place in this evolving community. Though he maintained his position at the church in town, he visited Clearwater regularly, his theological perspective gradually softening into something more inclusive without abandoning his core beliefs. The Reverend, who had once come to rescue, Sarah now consulted her on matters of community harmony, finding in her directness a refreshing counterpoint to the political maneuvering common in town. "The governor asks about Clearwater in every letter," he mentioned one autumn afternoon as he shared tea with Sarah and Robert on their porch. Baby Michael slept peacefully in a cradle of Sarah's design, combining the Apache cradleboard tradition with settler woodworking techniques. "He's considering bringing a delegation of territorial officials to observe what you've built here. Says it might serve as a model for other regions facing similar tensions." Sarah exchanged a glance with Robert, their communication requiring minimal words after years of partnership. "Officials welcome," she said, her English now fluent, though still carrying the rhythmic cadence of her first language. "But not as curiosity to study, as equals who might learn as we still learn each day." The Reverend smiled, his once rigid countenance softened by genuine respect. "I'll convey your sentiment exactly, though perhaps with more diplomatic flourish." Their conversation was interrupted by James rushing into the yard, his young face flushed with exertion and concern. "My pa, come quick, Mr. Cooper's taken ill at the mill. He collapsed and can't catch his breath." Sarah was already moving, reaching for her medicine pouch with practiced efficiency. "Fetch Rachel," she instructed James. "Tell her to bring the blue flower preparation. Robert, we need cool water and clean cloths." The following days revealed the nature of the crisis, a fever that spread rapidly through the settlement, affecting both Apache and settlers with equal severity. Symptoms progressed from difficulty breathing to high fever to profound weakness that left even the strongest confined to bed. Robert succumbed on the third day, his powerful frame suddenly vulnerable to the invisible enemy that had invaded their community. Sarah found him collapsed in the woodshed, his skin burning with fever, his breath coming in labored gasps. "Stay with me," she whispered as she helped him to their bed, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her heart. "Fight this as you have fought every challenge. Our work is not finished, Mshichei, my heart." The illness struck with particular virulence among the men, perhaps due to their work, bringing them into closer contact during the initial contagion. William fell ill, as did 3 other Apache elders and 5 settler men, including Reverend Johnson, who had remained to help tend the sick rather than returning to town. Sarah moved between bedsides with tireless determination, combining her knowledge of traditional remedies with what she had learned from settlement doctors. She created infusions of willow bark for fever poultices of specific moss that grew along the stream, to ease breathing tinctures of roots and herbs, whose properties she had studied since childhood. Emily showing her mother's composure beyond. Her years helped prepare remedies and cool compresses. James ran messages between households, ensuring no family faced the crisis alone. Rachel coordinated the Apache healers, working in seamless cooperation with Sarah and the settler women who had nursing experience. For 7 days and nights, the outcome remained uncertain. Robert's fever burned so high that Sarah feared his mind might be affected if he survived. William, already in his 7th decade, grew so weak that at times his breathing could barely be detected. The settlement held its collective breath, all normal activities suspended, as the battle against disease became the only priority. On the 8th morning, as dawn broke with gentle insistence over the eastern hills, Robert's fever finally broke. Sarah, who had dozed briefly in the chair beside their bed, woke to find his eyes open, clear and present for the first time in days. "I've been fighting for all of us," he said, his voice weak but lucid. "Haven't you slept at all?" Sarah pressed her palm to his cheek, confirming the blessed coolness of his skin. "Sleep comes later," she said simply. "Healing comes first." Throughout the day, similar scenes played out across the settlement. The fever released its grip, gradually leaving exhaustion in its wake, but taking no lives, a miracle attributable in no small part to the combined healing traditions that had been brought to bear against it. William recovered more slowly than the younger men, but his eyes retained their sharp wisdom when he was finally able to sit up and take broth from Rachel's hands. "Two rivers," he said to Sarah when she visited his dwelling, using the name he had given her that acknowledged both her Apache heritage and her new path. "Your medicine has kept death from our door." Sarah shook her head slightly, the gesture both humble and factual. "Not my medicine alone. Apache wisdom and settler knowledge together. What one lacks, the other provides. This is Clearwater's strength." Yes. As autumn deepened toward winter, the community recovered its rhythm, though with a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the strength found in mutual support. The experience had further cemented the bonds between the two peoples, creating shared stories of crisis faced and overcome together. Robert regained his strength gradually, his powerful frame rebuilding itself with Sarah's careful attention to nourishing foods and appropriate rest. By the first snowfall, he was able to resume most normal activities, though Sarah watched him with the attentive eye of both healer and wife, ensuring he did not push beyond his recovering capacity. One evening, as they sat by the hearth, watching Michael take his first tentative steps between pieces of furniture, Emily looked up from the book she was reading, a new skill she had mastered during the long hours of the illness when reading too. The sick had been one of her contributions. "The people in town are calling Ma the medicine woman now," she reported. "Mr. Wilson told Reverend Johnson that even his wife says she would trust Sarah's remedies over the town doctors." Robert smiled, watching Sarah's expression, not prideful but thoughtfully accepting of this new role the community had assigned her. "The fever showed everyone what we already knew," he said, "that wisdom doesn't belong to one tradition alone, and that Sarah's gift lies in bringing together what others would keep separate." Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Michael, her hands steadying his wobbling attempts at independence. "Not just my gift," she corrected gently. "Clearwater's gift. What we build together stronger than any one person alone." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, each flake unique, yet joining with others to transform the landscape. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, a family created not by convention, but by choice and commitment, watched their youngest member discover his growing capabilities. Each small victory celebrated, each stumble cushioned by supportive hands. The illness that had threatened their community had left no deaths in its wake, but it had changed them nonetheless, deepening their appreciation for the healing that came from integration rather than separation, from respecting difference while recognizing shared humanity. Like the stream that gave their settlement its name, they had found strength in joining what convention would keep apart, creating something that flowed clear and purposeful toward a horizon still being discovered with each passing season. Spring arrived at Clearwater with particular vibrancy, as if the earth itself celebrated the community's survival of both winter and illness. Wildflowers carpeted the surrounding hills in waves of color, blue lupines, orange poppies, purple phacelia, while the stream that gave the settlement its name ran full and swift, with snowmelt from distant peaks. The territorial governor's promised visit, delayed by the fever outbreak, was finally scheduled for early May. Unlike his first assessment 2 years prior, this visit would include journalists from as far away as San Francisco and Denver, along with officials interested in understanding how Clearwater had achieved what many had deemed impossible: genuine integration and cooperation between peoples with a history of conflict. Preparations occupied the community for weeks beforehand. Buildings were repaired, and freshly whitewashed gardens arranged to showcase both traditional Apache plantings and settler agricultural techniques. The schoolhouse prepared for demonstrations of the unique educational approach that had children speaking multiple languages, and moving confidently between different cultural frameworks. Sarah directed much of this activity with characteristic efficiency, her quiet authority recognized throughout the settlement. At 32, she had grown into her role as Clearwater's heart and conscience, her initial reserve transformed into a dignified presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Her son Michael, now a sturdy toddler with his father's build, and his mother's watchful eyes accompanied her everywhere, either riding on her hip or tottering alongside with determined independence. "The governor wishes you to speak at the welcome ceremony," Robert told her one evening as they reviewed preparations. Emily and James were helping Michael prepare for bed, their voices drifting from the next room in a blend of English and Apache, words that had become the natural language of their household. Sarah looked up from the medicine she was preparing, a preventative tonic to strengthen the elders, as spring transitions sometimes brought respiratory challenges. "What should I say to these important men?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already had clear ideas on the subject. Robert smiled, recognizing the question as rhetorical rather than uncertain. In their years together, he had learned to read the subtle indicators of Sarah's thoughts. The slight lift of her eyebrow that signaled skepticism, the momentary stillness that preceded important statements, the gentle humor that sometimes flickered across her serious features, like sunlight through leaves. "You'll say what needs saying," he replied with complete confidence. "As you always do." The day of the official visit dawned clear and mild, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed designed to showcase Clearwater at its best. Children lined the main path into the settlement, holding small flags they had created that combined elements of territorial and Apache symbolism. Adults gathered in their finest clothing, some in traditional Apache dress, others in settler Sunday, best many in combinations that reflected their personal journeys within the community. Governor Harrison arrived in an impressive caravan, 3 carriages containing officials, journalists with notepads at the ready, and a photographer whose bulky equipment required its own wagon. The governor himself had aged visibly in the years since his last visit, his hair now fully silver, his movements slightly slower, but his eyes remained sharp and evaluative. "Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Two Rivers," he greeted them formally using the name. Sarah had chosen that honored both her heritage and her new path. "Clearwater appears to have thrived since my last visit." "Welcome, Governor," Robert responded with equal formality. "We're honored by your interest in our community." The official tour proceeded much as planned. Demonstrations at the school where children recited knowledge in multiple languages, visits to the improved irrigation systems that combined ancient Apache water management with newer techniques, observations of the Justice Council, where disputes were resolved through a careful balance of traditions. The journalists scribbled constantly, occasionally asking questions that revealed their preconceptions. But who has final authority when traditions conflict? Answer: the council seeks consensus rather than authority. How do you handle religious differences? Answer: with respect and curiosity rather than conversion. Aren't there inevitable tensions between the races? Answer from William: we are not races here. We are people with different stories finding common chapters. The formal ceremony took place in the afternoon, with the entire settlement gathered. In the central plaza, Governor Harrison spoke first, his political experience evident in his careful balance of praise for Clearwater's achievements while maintaining neutrality regarding its more controversial aspects. "What we observe here today represents a unique approach to the challenges facing our expanding territory," he concluded. "While not without its complexities, Clearwater demonstrates possibilities worth serious consideration as we move forward into a shared future." When Sarah rose to speak, a hush fell over the gathering. She wore a dress that combined settler design with Apache beadwork, telling the story of her journey, her hair arranged in a style that similarly honored both traditions. Michael sat on Robert's lap nearby, his small face solemn, as if recognizing the importance of the moment, despite his young age. 3 summers ago, Sarah began her English clear, though still carrying the rhythmic cadence of her first language. "I lay dying beside a stream. Her stranger found me, man from people my people feared. He carried me to his home, tended my wounds, offered shelter without price. She paused, her gaze moving deliberately across the assembled officials and journalists. This place has taught us all that love can be language when words fail, that a look or gesture can cross borders. No treaty has bridged, that the hand extended in peace holds more power than the fist raised in anger. She spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, her words simple but profound, addressing not just the official visitors, but the community itself, acknowledging the challenges they had overcome, the losses they had transformed into connections, the daily choice to build rather than destroy. Clear water, not perfect place, she concluded, her honesty characteristic and compelling. We still learn each day how to listen better, how to honor difference without erasing it, how to create path wide enough for all to walk together. But our children now dream in multiple languages, see with wider vision than their parents. This is seed we plant for generations we will not see. As she finished speaking, Michael escaped Robert's lap and toddled to his mother's arms, raised in unambiguous demand. Sarah lifted him effortlessly, this physical demonstration of Clearwater's future, embodied in one small child, carrying the heritage of both peoples in his very being. The impact of her words was visible on the faces of the visitors, some moved to obvious emotion, others thoughtful and reassessing or recognizing. They had witnessed something more profound than the quaint cultural experiment some had expected to document. The governor approached Sarah as the formal portion of the visit concluded the private conversation that followed unrecorded by the busy journalists. My administration will be issuing official recognition of Clearwater as a protected settlement within the territory, he told her quietly, with specific provisions for preserving the unique governance structure you've established here. Sarah inclined her head in acknowledgement, neither effusive in gratitude nor dismissive of the significance. Recognition welcome, she said simply. But Clearwater's strength comes from within, not from paper declarations. The governor smiled slightly, recognition in his expression. That's precisely why it deserves protection, Mrs. Two Rivers. Some experiments are too valuable to be left vulnerable to the winds of political change. As the official party prepared to depart, journalists made final notes, and the photographer arranged for one last image. The entire community gathered before the schoolhouse, Apache and settlers intermingled without clear divisions, children of both heritages in the foreground, the stream visible in the background, like the idea that had given the settlement both its name and its ethos. That evening, after the visitors had departed in a cloud of dust and promises of favorable reports, the community gathered for a more intimate celebration, not of the official recognition, though that was certainly welcome, but of the journey they had undertaken together, the challenges overcome, the future still unfolding before them. Under a canopy of emerging stars with lanterns creating pools of golden light throughout the settlement, music from both traditions merged into something new, yet rooted in ancient rhythms. Children played games that borrowed elements from multiple cultures, elders shared stories that preserved wisdom, while adding new chapters, and at the center of it all, Sarah and Robert moved through the celebration, their presence a testament to the power of seeing beyond established boundaries. They were impressed by you, Robert told Sarah as they found a moment of relative quiet at the edge of the gathering. The governor, the journalists, all of them. Sarah shook her head slightly, the gesture both humble and practical. Not me. They should see, she corrected. What we all build together. Clearwater, not one person's vision, but many hands working toward shared horizon. Robert smiled, recognizing in her response the wisdom that had first drawn him to this remarkable woman, her ability to perceive essential truths beneath surface appearances, to value substance over recognition, to understand that lasting change came not from individual achievement, but from collective transformation. Michael had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, his small face peaceful in complete security. Emily and James danced with their friends nearby, their movements containing elements of both Apache and settler traditions, transformed into something that belonged fully to neither heritage, but honored both. As the celebration continued around them, stars appearing in greater abundance overhead, Robert and Sarah stood together in quiet communion, their joined lives a testament to the possibility that even in a land scarred by division, clear water could still flow between separated shores, carrying hope forward into territories yet unmapped but increasingly within view. The years flowed like the stream that gave Clearwater its name, sometimes rushing forward in periods of growth and change, sometimes moving more gently through seasons of consolidation and reflection. 2 decades passed, transforming the experimental settlement into an established community known throughout the territory for its unique approach to cooperation and cultural respect. Robert's hair had silvered entirely, lines of experience etched. Around his eyes and mouth, his tall frame still strong but moving, with the deliberate care of a man in his 6th decade. Sarah's dark hair now carried streaks of white at the temples, her face bearing the dignified beauty of a woman who had lived fully and purposefully, her movements still containing the quiet grace that had characterized her since youth. Their cabin had expanded over the years into a comfortable home at the heart of the settlement, its walls adorned with weavings that told stories of their journey, shelves filled with books in multiple languages, windows positioned to capture both sunrise and sunset. From its porch, they could observe much of what they had helped create. The thriving school now educating a 3rd generation of Clearwater children, the meeting house where justice and governance continued to evolve, homes that combined elements of both founding cultures while developing Clearwater's own distinctive architecture. Emily, now 26, had become the school's principal teacher, her natural gift for languages and cultural translation making her particularly suited to maintaining Clearwater's educational vision. She had married Joseph, a young Apache man who had come to the settlement as a teenager, their union symbolizing the community's continued commitment to integration without erasure of cultural identity. James had journeyed further afield, studying law in San Francisco, before returning to serve as Clearwater's representative to territorial authorities, his understanding of both traditions making him uniquely qualified to navigate the complex legal landscape as the region moved toward statehood. At 32, he carried himself with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's perceptive gaze. Michael, 20, embodied Clearwater's promise in his very being. With his father's strong build and his mother's dark, observant eyes, he moved easily between worlds, equally comfortable in Apache ceremonies and territorial political gatherings. Recently elected as the settlement's youngest ever council member, he approached governance with an innate balance of pragmatism and vision that many attributed to his unique heritage. Remembrance Day had become Clearwater's most significant annual celebration, marking the anniversary of the settlement's founding. Each year, the community gathered to retell its origin story, to honor those who had helped establish its principles, and to welcome newcomers into its continuing narrative. Sarah stood at the edge of the stream as preparations for the 20th Remembrance Day reached completion, her fingers absently touching the bone amulet that had accompanied her through every transition. The water caught the afternoon light, transforming ordinary ripples into momentary gold, a fitting metaphor for how time had transformed what began as desperate necessity into enduring blessing. Robert joined her by the water's edge, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of those who have traveled long distances together, both geographical and spiritual. "William would be proud," he said quietly, referring to Sarah's father who had passed peacefully 5 winters before his legacy secured in the thriving community and the traditions preserved while allowing for evolution. Sarah nodded, her expression reflective rather than sorrowful. "He sees," she said with simple certainty. "All ancestors watch what we build, guide our hands when we listen well." The celebration began as the sun lowered toward the western hills, casting long golden light across the settlement. Tables had been arranged in a great circle around the central plaza, laden with food that represented both founding cultures and innovations unique to Clearwater. Children wore special clothing for the occasion, some in traditional Apache designs, others in settler styles, many in combinations that reflected their particular family histories. Michael, as the youngest council member, opened the formal ceremony, with words in 3 languages, Apache, English, and Spanish, welcoming those gathered and acknowledging the significance of the occasion. His confidence and natural authority reminded many of both his parents, though he had developed his own distinctive presence. 20 years ago, he began, Two streams joined that tradition said should remain separate. From that joining clear water was born, not erasing what came before but creating something new that honored its sources while flowing toward a future neither could have reached alone. The community's elders were honored, first those who had been present at the settlements, founding given places of respect at the central table. Sarah and Robert sat side by side, their presence a living embodiment of the vision that had guided Clearwater from its inception, not mere tolerance of difference, but genuine integration that strengthened rather than diminished distinct traditions. As twilight deepened into evening, lanterns were lit throughout the settlement, creating constellations on Earth to mirror those appearing in the sky above. Stories were shared around fire circles, some from Apache tradition, others from settler history, many from Clearwater's own developing folklore that incorporated elements of both while establishing its unique identity. The culmination of the celebration came when the newest generation of children, those born entirely within Clearwater's distinctive culture, performed a dance that moved fluidly between traditional Apache movements and settler folk patterns accompanied by music that similarly bridged worlds. Their small faces shone with pride and belonging, unconscious of the revolutionary nature of what had become normal to them, existing between cultures not as a hardship but as an enrichment. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself drawn back to the stream, seeking a moment of quiet reflection amidst the joyful noise of celebration. She sat on the bank where Robert had found her injured and unconscious 2 decades earlier, feeling the symmetry of returning to this place on this particular anniversary. Emily joined her mother by the water, sitting beside her with the easy companionship of women who had shared a lifetime of understanding. At 26, Emily's face had matured into a beauty that combined her birth mother's delicate features with the strength of character developed under Sarah's influence. "Are you all right, Mother?" she asked softly, using the title she had given Sarah years ago, when she was old enough to understand that love created family more surely than blood alone. Sarah smiled, the expression warming her serious features. "Just remembering," she replied. "Long journey from that first day, many changes, many challenges, but good path, yes." Emily nodded her hand, finding Sarah's in a gesture that mirrored how Sarah and Robert often communicated, touch conveying what words might inadequately express. "The best path," she affirmed. "You taught us all that borders can become bridges when approached with courage." They sat in companionable silence for a time, the sounds of celebration creating a joyful backdrop to their private communion. When Emily finally spoke again, her voice carried a gentle question. "What are you thinking about so deeply?" Sarah considered before answering, her natural thoughtfulness unchanged by years of increasing verbal fluency. "Thinking about what remains when we are gone," she finally said. "Not buildings or even laws, but the way of seeing that Clearwater teaches. The courage to look beyond what is familiar, to find value in difference, to build rather than destroy." From within the small pouch she still carried, descended from the one William had given her years before, Sarah withdrew the bone amulet that had adorned her neck since childhood. Its surface was worn smooth from decades of handling its carved symbols, still visible, but softened by time like wisdom distilled to its essence. "This protected me through many crossings," she said, holding the amulet in her palm where moonlight illuminated its simple beauty. "Now time for new generation to carry forward." Understanding dawned in Emily's expression. "For Sophia?" she asked, referring to her daughter, now 6 years old and bearing her grandmother Catherine's middle name, in honor of Robert's first wife, a gesture that acknowledged all streams that had joined to create Clearwater's flow. Sarah nodded, a gentle smile illuminating her face. "When we cannot speak, this will speak for her. When path seems unclear, this will remind her of waters that joined to make her journey possible." The next evening, as the celebration continued, in the gentle rhythm that characterized Clearwater's communal life, Sarah gathered her family in the quiet sanctuary of their home. 3 generations sat in the circle of lamplight, Robert beside her, their children with their spouses, and the grandchildren who represented Clearwater's future, embodied in individual lives. Sophia, Emily's daughter, sat at Sarah's feet, her small face solemn with the intuitive recognition of an important moment. Sarah removed the amulet that had accompanied her through every transition of her remarkable journey. "This protected me when Stream carried me between worlds," she explained, her voice soft but clear. "Protected me when I learned new language, new ways. Protected me when fever came, when challenges arose." She held the amulet in her palm, where firelight caught its polished surface. "Now it will protect you, little one, as you carry Clear Water's story forward." The child accepted the gift with instinctive reverence, her fingers tracing the worn symbols, as if already understanding their significance transcended their physical form. "What do the marks mean, grandmother?" she asked, her young voice carrying the natural curiosity that Sarah had always encouraged. "They tell story of mountains and valleys, of journeys and returns," Sarah explained. "But most important meaning comes from what you add to story. Each person who carries this adds new chapter, without erasing what came before." Sophia nodded with surprising gravity, for one so young, carefully placing the amulet around her neck, where it would remain for decades to come, acquiring new meaning. With each transition, it witnessed each challenge it accompanied, each joy it shared. Later that night, as the settlement quieted into peaceful slumber, Sarah and Robert sat on their porch beneath a canopy of stars that had witnessed their unlikely union and its remarkable fruition. The night air carried the scent of sage and pine, the distant murmur of the stream providing gentle counterpoint to the chorus of crickets and nightbirds. 20 years, Robert mused, his hand finding Sarah's with the easy familiarity of those who have traveled vast distances together, both geographical and spiritual. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday I found you by the stream. Other times it seems we've always been building Clear Water together." Sarah nodded, her gaze taking in the settlement that had grown from desperate necessity to thriving community. Lamplight still glowed in scattered windows, each representing families and individuals whose lives had been transformed by the vision they had dared to implement against considerable odds. "Stream always knows where it must flow," she said softly, the poetic quality of her speech unchanged despite decades of English fluency. "Even when rocks block path, water finds way forward, like us." They sat in companionable silence, two people whose lives had intersected against all probability and conventional wisdom, creating ripples that continued to expand outward in ways neither could have imagined that first desperate day. Michael had recently been approached about representing Clear Water's governance model to communities facing similar divisions in other territories. Emily's educational methods were being studied by progressive teachers, seeking better approaches to increasingly diverse student populations. James had helped draft legislation that protected cultural integration while respecting distinct traditions. "Are you satisfied with what we've built?" Robert asked, genuinely curious about her assessment after all these years. Sarah considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness before answering. "Not satisfied," she finally said, "because work never complete, but grateful. Grateful Stream carried me here. Grateful you had courage to help stranger from people you were taught to fear. Grateful we built bridge strong enough for many to cross." As midnight approached, Sarah felt a curious lightness spreading through her body, a sensation not of weakness, but of completion. The bone-deep fatigue that had troubled her in recent months seemed to dissolve, replaced by a serene awareness that encompassed Clear Water's past, present, and future in a single moment of perfect clarity. "Robert," she said quietly, her hand tightening, slightly in his, "remember always that love needs no translation. This truth we discovered together, yes." He turned to her, something in her tone alerting him to the significance of the moment. "Yes," he affirmed, searching her face in the gentle moonlight. "That's the truth at the heart of everything we've built." Sarah smiled, the expression illuminating her features with a beauty that transcended age or circumstance. "Good," she said, simply. "Remember." That night, as the settlement slept in peaceful security, Sarah Two Rivers slipped away as quietly and purposefully as she had lived, not in pain or fear, but in the serene completion of a journey well traveled. Robert discovered her at dawn, her body still and peaceful, her expression one of completion rather than interruption. The community mourned deeply but without despair, recognizing that Sarah's essence remained in the very foundation of Clearwater, in its governance that balanced individual freedom with communal responsibility, in its education that preserved distinct traditions while fostering meaningful integration in its daily practices, that demonstrated how difference could strengthen rather than divide. At her funeral, conducted with elements from both Apache tradition and settler customs, William's son Daniel, long since reconciled with the community, spoke words that captured what many felt. She taught us that the strongest voice is often the quietest, that the most powerful act is extending a hand across division, that the truest legacy is not what we build for ourselves, but what we make possible for others. Years passed, the stream continued its eternal journey, and Clearwater flourished as new generations carried forward its founding vision with innovations of their own. Robert lived to see his grandchildren reach adulthood, his quiet strength, a steady presence as the settlement navigated territorial politics and eventually statehood, without compromising its unique character. On the anniversary of Sarah's passing each year, the children of Clearwater, those of Apache heritage settler descent, and the increasing number of mixed ancestry, would visit the stream where it all began, carrying branches, stones, and flowers, to form a circle where they would repeat the words that had become part of the settlement's essential mythology. Here came a woman who did not speak, but taught us to listen to each other. Here came a man who opened his home and found a larger dwelling. Here two streams joined and became clear water flowing forward into lands yet undiscovered. When Robert finally joined Sarah in the great beyond Sophia, by then a woman of 30, with children of her own, stood by the stream wearing the bone amulet her grandmother had given her. She watched the water flowing over stones, constantly changing, yet somehow eternal, and understood with perfect clarity that love truly needed no translation, that compassion could bridge the widest divisions, that the most profound language was often spoken without words. The story of Robert and Sarah became more than local legend. It transformed into a vision of what might be possible when fear yielded to compassion, when difference was viewed as strength rather than threat, when people dared to imagine a world where clear water flowed between previously separated shores, carrying possibility rather than division into territories still being discovered with each new generation. In Sophia's hand, the bone amulet caught the morning light, worn smooth by decades of handling its symbol, softened but still visible like wisdom distilled to its essence. And in the gentle murmur of the stream, those with ears to hear might still detect the quiet certainty of Sarah's voice, different but same heart, like stream joining river, stronger together than apart.